The two-year-long battle between broadcasters and Aereo came to a head yesterday, and attorneys for both sides made oral arguments before the Supreme Court. You'll remember Aereo sells micro antennas to subscribers for about $8 a month, allowing them to live stream and record broadcast television in select markets. The networks and cable companies have fought the service, claiming it's abusing their copyright to original content.
I think what's at stake at this case is really the nature of broadcast television as we know it. Because if a company like Aereo can somehow provide content to lots of paying strangers without engaged in a public performance, I think the networks, at least some of them, will have to rethink the way that they provide content. Because I think the traditional understanding has been, certainly since 1976, that when somebody like a cable company retransmits broadcast over the airways, from the airways to their cable consumers, they're certainly engaged in public performance. And if that changes, particularly if it changes in a way that suggests that over-the-air broadcasts are uniquely vulnerable to this kind of maneuvering, I do think that companies are going to have to take that into account in determining where they provide their content and what formats they use.
That was Paul Clement. He made the arguments on behalf of the broadcast entities before the court. Aereo's attorney says this isn't about copyright at all.
From our perspective, the issue in the case was whether consumers who've always had a right to have an antenna and a DVR in their home and to make copies of local over-the-air broadcast television, that right should be infringed at all simply by moving the antenna and the DVR to the cloud. We're cautiously optimistic, based on the way the hearing went today, that the court understood that when a person watching over-the-air broadcast television in his or her home is engaging in a private performance and not a public performance, that would implicate the Copyright Act.
We won't know the court's decision until mid-June, maybe even later, but what might we glean from some of the questions that the justices asked yesterday?
Well, I think what they're trying to figure out is whether or not this is going to be an issue that sort of dates back to when we had VCRs and that sort of thing, whether or not people could actually record. And they're trying to determine whether or not this is going to be some infringement upon broadcasters and their ability to make a profit, but then at the same time, the consumers having access to what is considered to be public airways.
I mean, all we know for the moment is the questions that were asked by the justices in the hearing the other day. And Chief Justice Roberts seemed pretty skeptical about whether, setting up a whole bunch of little antennas wasn't really just a way to get around the law, and so that perhaps they were violating copyright. On the other hand, you had some of the other justices, including Justice Kagan and Sotomayor, were basically saying, we're worried about whether or not ruling in favor of the broadcasters could harm other companies and individuals storing content in the cloud, so to speak. So I don't know where it's going to come down. I will say you can make both cases. I mean, Aereo says, all we're basically doing is say, we're like Radio Shack, except instead of having to buy your own individual pairs of rabbit ears, you can rent them from us. We'll charge you a little bit, and then you can watch your local shows. On the other hand, it's pretty obvious that instead of setting up one big antenna to do the same thing, they're setting up all the little bitty ones as a runaround to the current law.
And they're charging you $8 a month, which could easily go up. So, but they're controlling those little bitty antennas.
On the other hand, I mean, part of this has to do with a natural reaction of innovators who see a situation where the consumer isn't being served well, where there's a lot of money at play that can be taken advantage of if you can serve those consumers better. My own daughter and millions of other people in the United States, for example, they no longer subscribe to cable, or they buy the lowest basic package they can get. Then they subscribe to Netflix or Hulu or some other service to get the other shows they want to watch, and they've got it made. That's the TV they want to watch, and that's the market that Aereo is trying to aim at. By themselves, nobody wants to just have Aereo and watch a few local broadcast stations, but if you take that with some of these other services combined, you can save a heck of a lot of money and get the TV you really want to watch.
And I think what's happening here is that the audience, that consumers really want to be able to pick and choose what they're going to watch on television and when they're going to watch it. And I think that's eventually what's happening here. And the question becomes, who's going to be in charge of the transmission? Who's going to be in charge of the distribution? That sort of thing. And ultimately, we're going to get there, but it's going to be these kinds of lawsuits that I think are going to move us in that direction.
Here's my worry, though, Amy. In the short run, I think it's really just a battle of millionaires and billionaires against each other to control who's going to have the market. But here's where it could be a real damage to the users and consumers. Local television stations. Right now, they make their money from advertising, but they also increasingly make their money from getting retransmission fees from the cable companies and the networks.
Which in our market right now, we're even seeing KOMU is blocked out right now by DirecTV.
And this is the second one this year.
That's
right.
right.
KMIZ was in this situation a couple of months ago.
Mm-hmm.
But if you think about it, the only reason you have an over-the-air broadcast station, a local station, is, the largest percentage of the programming by far is network programming. Some larger market stations do a lot of local news, and some in medium markets like ours do as well. But what happens if the network, if Aereo wins, for example, or just inevitably internet becomes the way that we distribute television content? Why do we need local stations? And if we don't have local stations, where does the local news, get produced, right? And if the advertising is not enough to support local television news right now, we need to have people paying for it directly. We've got to figure out a new business model, or local television news is in trouble.